So just a nice little video to break up this lecture and to have us think about the different elements that go into making decisions, especially when we think about how we're going to prepare, what we're going to be prepared to deal with. And this guy is just an extremist, right? We could see he was carrying an extremely light pack. He did the summit of Mont Blanc from the Courmayeur, the Italian side, finishing up in Chamonix on the French side of Mont Blanc in 8 hours and I think it was 47 minutes with extremely minimal gear. And you could see him running by people on the trail who had packed for a multiple day expedition to the top, and really what he has is incredibly minimal. So in light of all this, here's a little quotation from Kilian Jornet's blog. This happened right now, it's September 23rd, 2013. I think this happened about 3 weeks ago, so it was right at the beginning of September. He was basically rescued off of the Guide-Midi, which is in Chamonix, a place he's frequented many times. It sounds like he was on just a training run with a friend. They had gone out in the morning, packed their gear, they looked at the weather. It seemed like it was probably going to only be bad in the afternoon. They were pretty confident with the route that they were going to get done in the early afternoon. Sure enough, they get up there, they get off route, they have the gear that they think to finish the route, but they definitely knew they didn't have the gear to survive a storm up there. Ended up, they had to call rescue. So this is one of the most talented athletes in the world for his discipline, obviously, and he still put himself in an area of risk. And really for him, what he's trying to accomplish, there's no other way to do it. He's accepting a certain level of risk and a certain level of unpreparedness if things don't go right. And we see that in this situation, this rescue ended up being the result of that. So it's really just interesting food for thought and discussion among you guys. Hopefully we'll set up a nice discussion board for you guys to kind of talk about the things that you commonly bring with you, when you might leave various items at home, and when you kind of bring the whole kitchen sink. But it's at least an interesting human being to observe. So, a review of some heat loss mechanisms right before we get into our meat of this discussion, which is really about clothing. So we have different mechanisms of heat loss. The big players in our situation tend to be convection. So obviously everyone's heard of a wind chill. Convection is a really, really fast way to get nice and cold, especially in a cold, windy environment. Naturally, we're constantly losing a certain amount of heat to radiation. Basically, our bodies are generating heat. We're slightly warmer than the surroundings. Some of that heat is being radiated to the outside. We do lose heat by evaporation. If you can remember, that's our primary heat loss mechanism when it is hot and we're perspiring. That sweat that we create is intended to evaporate. That process of evaporation helps to draw heat away from our body and dissipate it into the atmosphere. We have conduction as well, and again, that's between two solid objects, a transfer of heat from the hot object to the cold object, so it can work kind of both ways. If we have a hot water bottle, we're utilizing conduction from that solid object placed on our skin to our solid object that is our body that's at a lower temperature. And these are the ways we want to both prevent heat loss and utilize when we're treating hypothermia. And straight into clothing. So the first word up here, the first phrase we see is layering techniques. I'm sure people have heard about this. It's not that uncommon in the modern day to discuss the theory of layering techniques when we go outside. But basically what we want to stress with all of these layering techniques is that you have multiple levels of comfort. So if we're going out on a cool spring day, we want to be able to be happy and comfortable in the morning when the temperatures may be in the 40s or 50s, as well as comfortable in the afternoon when the temperatures are maybe nearing 70s, and again, comfortable again at night if we get stuck out there and the temperatures drop below zero. And layering is really the most efficient way to accomplish this. So we're going to start from the inside and move to the outside. On the inside, we really want something nice and moisture wicking. It can be a short sleeve, it can be a long sleeve shirt, synthetic wool, non-cotton. So the reason why we don't like cotton is that cotton really doesn't maintain its warming effects when it gets wet. So if we wake up in the morning, it's nice and cool. By the time the afternoon hits, we're working hard, we're sweating, we're making our clothing wet. If we don't have the opportunity to make that moisture evaporate and our cotton shirt stays nice and wet, by the time the sun drops and the heat of the day dissipates and we're starting to get cold, that cotton's really not doing anything for us to keep us warm while it's wet. Synthetics and wools, on the other hand, will retain a good portion of their insulating quality when they are mildly wet. Now, if something gets completely wet, really no matter what that object is or what that piece of clothing is, we're going to have to dry that out before it really helps us warm up. So again, that's that underlying. It can be both on the top and the bottom, whether it's in the form of a shirt or long underwear. We want some underlying insulation as well. So we're kind of going to call that our base layer. It's really a nice way to wick moisture away. It's starting to insulate somewhat, but now we want to start stacking up some layers of material that are going to help trap that heat that we're trying to constantly radiate off of our body. So that can come in the form of a polar fleece. It can be integrated in some sort of jacket like a soft shell, but the main idea of it is that it's capturing that heat and making sure it doesn't escape our body. A really great one is our kind of down thermal insulating jackets. We'll get into the discussion of down and synthetic here in a moment, but really these again are designed to keep that warmth in. On the outside of that, we want some sort of weather protection, because as soon as it starts hailing or snowing, we want to be able to throw something on that's not going to disrupt the performance of our layers underneath. Variable levels of warmth, already mentioned that. Eye protection is extremely important in especially our environment, especially when it snows. Very easily you can have some UV damage to your eyes if you're not constantly wearing sunglasses. You see that during this lecture I have sun protection on my head. I really don't leave the door in New Mexico without it. Finally, listed on here, we have some face and head protection. It's possible to lose up to 50% of our heat through our head. We have an extreme high amount of blood supply to our head, especially when we get cold. That percentage goes up even further, because we're not going to sacrifice our brain in the event of hypothermia. We're going to keep it nice and warm, so it's going to consistently lose heat unless we protect against it. Face protection, great for the wind. And what's not listed on there, obviously, our extremities. Some gloves, depending on the time of year, and definitely feet, boots, and we have socks, obviously, as well. So let's talk a little bit about some technology of our equipment. There's this fancy thing called Gore-Tex that I'm sure everybody's heard of. Gore-Tex is really they were the first guys to come up with this innovative technology, but nowadays every different company has had access to this patent and is utilizing similar sorts of technology for their what we call waterproof and breathable equipment. So that's the main principle here. As we can see by this diagram, we're allowing the breathability of water vapor to escape while also allowing the water droplets and the moisture creating mechanism out. So we want to keep the water out, we want to allow the vaporization to escape. What this really is great for is a nice waterproof shell that allows you to breathe when you get nice and worked up and sweaty. You're starting to create water vapor. That water vapor is able to escape, and so you'll be able to dry out a little bit if you slow down, and if that water that's caught on the inside continues to vaporize, continues to move out, while also maintaining that barrier between you and the rain or snow or whatever you have outside. Other advantage is it blocks wind, and as we talked about earlier, convection by wind, blowing wind in a cold environment is going to get us cold really, really fast. So here's our discussion between synthetic versus down. Synthetic is basically a insulating material that's modeled after a sort of down. It's modeled after essentially a cotton. What it does is it creates a lot of space for this heat and this warm air to get trapped before escaping to the outside. It kind of creates a buffer system between our hot skin, the air that it's heating. It retains that heat inside of our clothing. So synthetic is great for a few reasons and has a few drawbacks as well. The reason why we like to use it commonly in the outdoors is because it maintains some of its insulation when wet. So we talked about cotton. The drawback with cotton is that when it gets wet, it doesn't work very well in terms of keeping it warm. Synthetic, as I mentioned, for a base layer, but as well for a sleeping bag or a synthetic down jacket. The nice thing is if it gets wet, it's not screwed up. It doesn't clump together. It can maintain some of that warmth. The technology is constantly getting better. If you look at synthetic jackets and synthetic bags, 10 years ago they were much bulkier, for the weight, they weren't very warm, but down still has its role, especially depending on your style. I personally prefer to wear down. Part of that is because I live in New Mexico. I commonly recreate in Colorado and the Southwest, where we just don't have a lot of high moisture days. Maybe it snows, maybe it rains a little bit, but it's easy enough for me to maintain against it. So it's really, really warm per weight of the content that you're carrying. So a nice down jacket's very, very compressible. It fits in your bag. It doesn't kick up a lot of your weight restriction, and it's great for that purpose. If it gets wet, the down tends to clump, and again, what we want is a nice thick layer that's able to prevent that escape from that radiation. The down, when it's clumped, isn't going to do that very well. So just a brief discussion on synthetic versus down materials for you. Moving down to our feet, most important thing is to break in your boots. If you've done any kind of backpacking or hiking with new boots on, you know how bad it is to have blisters. Going back to that, to a different article, but similar in nature to the first one that we examined, we have one entitled Medical Incidents and Evacuations on Wilderness Expeditions. This was a review of a bunch of NOLS trips, obviously large population of younger people, didn't encounter a whole lot of chronic illnesses that required evacuation, which isn't surprising. Certainly athletic injuries and other musculoskeletal injuries accounted for the vast majority of evacuations, but surprisingly 2.7% required evacuations for blisters. And that's astonishing to me, because having a blister is one thing, treating a blister is another. Sucking it up and continuing to walk out, yeah, that's probably going to happen a lot, but then to see the number 2.7% requiring evacuation of people is really, really staggering. And really that could be nice and prevented if we were all to take the time to break in our boots before we get outside. Really take that time and avoid this silly problem. So again, in this world of heat retention, we know that it's easy enough to die from hypothermia within a 3-hour time frame. So that 3 hours is very, very short, and we want to ensure that we aren't susceptible to that sort of death. So another thing that can help us out is improvised shelters. We see here just a nice lean-to created with some thick pine trees, a fire next to that as well. We have a snow cave on the looker's right side. That's a good example of another way to improvise a shelter if you don't bring one with you. Fire essentials. So again, on that theme of 3 hours of survival for any kind of hypothermia related death, well, we really want to prevent from hypothermia. A great way to do that is to be able to reliably light fires. People bring lighters, some people bring fire starters. My recommendation is you have some sort of reliable fire starter. You might bring a lighter or two, but also have what we have up here in looker's right, which is a flint and steel. It's a sparker mechanism. Get used to using these things. Make fires reliably with minimal material, and then when everything comes to a head and you've lost a portion of your pack that maybe had the lighter in it, you have your trusty flint and steel on you. Some Vaseline embedded cotton balls work great for just that initial part of the fire, or what we call tinder, and then have a really good method for starting fires. The one that I prefer is somewhat demonstrated here. It looks a bit like a teepee, but basically creating a nice little hole, having a support beam up here, having a nice place for a platform where you're going to put your tinder, and having progressively larger kindling from very, very small, almost pencil lead size, out to a larger half a centimeter, 2 centimeter diameter twigs. So practice these techniques. Unfortunately, we don't have the time in this course to practice them, but there's a wealth of information on survival and out on the internet, as well as in some great books. So we talked about our 3-hour time limit on hypothermia killing us. Well, now we're going to move into water. How long can we live without water? Well, generally it's only about 3 days. So what are we going to start looking for first? Well, we're going to start looking for our gear to protect against hypothermia. We're worried about that 3-hour time zone when we're considering our survival. We're going to transition into looking for food and looking for water and acquiring the fluids that we need to stay alive and continue at optimal performance. And that really starts before you walk out of the door. And that's having enough water for the day or for how long you're going to be out there, and anticipating that maybe things aren't going to go quite as well as you wanted them to. We have a nice study here that says 1 hour of hard cycling requires 100 milliliters every 5 minutes for optimal replacement. Doing that math, for a 12-hour day, that requires 6 liters just to give 50% optimal rehydration. So obviously an extreme amount of water. I'm not saying that you have to bring all of that water. I'm not saying that you always have to drink the water that you do bring, but understanding how much quantities of water we can lose, especially when engaging in heavy exercise out in the wilderness. It's good to have an appreciation for that. So for me personally, I generally strive even for less than 50% optimal replenishment if I'm going out for a long day in the mountains. Granted, it's probably not the hottest day, and you have to look at a few different factors, but I'm normally carrying a minimum of 2, maximum of 3 liters. If it's a rescue scenario, obviously bringing a lot more, and if it's an overnight trip, some strategizing in terms of how you're going to utilize your water is very, very important. So now I'm going to leave you with this question, and I'm not going to answer it. You all are going to answer it in the online discussion that's attached to this lecture. But my question to you is overhydration dangerous, and why? So I want you guys to look up some case studies on overhydration, drinking too much water, specifically water, throughout the day, and what kind of problems we can see resulting from overhydration. So what can we do for water? Well, we have a few different water procurement methods. Obviously, we hope we're in an area where we can gain access to natural water that's existing out for us in nice streams or lakes. When we get that water, we need some sort of disinfection. And if we don't have an access to water, there's a couple of things we can do. So there's a few different techniques here up in our looker's right-hand corner of the screen. One is a plastic bag tied around a tree, hanging there with a little bit of water in there. So what the heck is going on? Well, plants, thankfully, do this thing called transpiration. So they are constantly emitting water vapor throughout the day. If we put a plastic bag around that water vapor can collect on the inside of our bag. It can condense into an actual liquid form of water, and we can collect that in the bottom of our bag. And that's a pretty decent method when you cannot find other sources of water to try to start collecting water. We recently had a trip out towards Cabazon Peak. We used a couple of pinon trees out there to do some water procurement on, and we were able to get around 50 to 100 cc's after about 8 hours in one bag doing this transpiration method. A few technique tips for you. Use clear plastic bags. They're a little bit hard to come by nowadays, but a big clear plastic trash bag is going to work better than black or white. And carry a couple, right? 50 cc's in 8 hours, well, that's not very good water replenishment. So carry 10, 12 bags maybe if you're going out in a situation where you might actually have to procure water by this method. Next to it, we see something called a solar still, and it's great. It says skill level easy. My experience, and not to mention it has this nice water bottle filled up with water, it's dripping. That's not a realistic representation of a solar still. We've built quite a few of these solar stills and exercises throughout the years. Do not get great success with them. You have to be very, very diligent. I'm sure in different parts of the country where there's more moisture in the soil and there's more moisture and transpiration happening in the plant material, it's quite a possibility that they do work in other parts of the country. But for us, the best method is really the transpiration bags attached to a living tree. Down in the corner, we do see a couple of different water sterilization techniques. I say the word sterilization. In reality, what we're doing in the wilderness is disinfection. We're not quite sterilizing. We're expecting that there's going to be a certain number of bugs and critters still in our water, but we're getting it down to a level where we're hopefully preventing an infection. So we have a nice electron microscope picture of Giardia versus Cryptosporidium, which are two common bugs inside of our drinking water that we might see. We can see that the Cryptosporidium is much, much smaller than the Giardia. All I'm trying to let you kind of in on in this discussion is that you need to do some research about the techniques that you use. Use some research about the environment that you're planning to treat in. Call up the local Forest Service, talk to the BLM, whoever is involved in that area, and they can give you some good recommendations for water disinfection. They might suggest a filter, they might suggest iodine tablets, they might suggest some sort of chlorine-based tablet, they might even say that ultraviolet radiation works well. Really look into what it is that you're going to encounter and the best way to prevent infection. So finally, we come to food in our little topic of survival. We see that we can live for about 3 months without food on average. So that's kind of our lowest priority when we're considering a survival technique, but it's something to consider nonetheless. And it's obviously going to impact our psychological state and our ability to extricate an environment. Our body does have a great mechanism of utilizing its own resources for food when external food is not available. But at the end of the day, we want to know some techniques. So I have some very basic recommendations here for you. Plants are tricky. There are certain plants that you can eat. It really depends on the environment that you live in and how often you're identifying these plants correctly, understanding which parts of the plants you can eat and what their nutritional content are. In general, we find that bugs are safe, so eating, as long as you're not allergic to any of them. Ants, crickets, grubs, all of these things, worms, they're great things to eat. They come actually pretty highly packed with nutrients, and in general, we're not going to have an adverse reaction to them. Mushrooms, just stay away. Maybe if you're a very proficient mushroom identifier as your hobby, that's a great thing, but in a survival situation, you can make a mistake that can become very, very quickly deadly. Finally, we have cacti over here. You can make a nice cacti stew. This particular cactus is one that we commonly find here in New Mexico, and it can very easily be peeled, thrown in a cup of boiling water, and it turns into a pretty gelatinous but moderately edible piece of plant material that we can utilize for some energy. So another one to put in your bag of tricks. Again, with any of these things, if you're extending outside of these basic recommendations, make sure you know what you're dealing with. Finally, we have a topic of traps. So if we're not looking for the veggies or the insects, maybe we can find some animals. Here we have a few recommendations over on the left. Just use many traps. Obviously, it's going to increase your chances. It's not likely that one trap is going to meet your nutritional needs. Check them often, regularly, and make sure you take them down before you leave. But what we have here is what's called a squirrel pole initially. So we have a nice thin piece of wire. This needs to be a very, very thin piece of wire that you might be able to get at Hobby Lobby. It might be some sort of, jewelry type wire, very, very thin, malleable. We want to be able to attach this thing to our tree or our post that we've put up against a tree, creating a small loop that squirrel might get stuck in. And as you can see along the length of this, we're going to put maybe 15 or 20 different loops at slightly different angles to the vertical of that pole. That'll ensure that hopefully they fall into that guy. A little grim here, but they're going to be hanging from that when you come find them. Definitely a decent way to try to catch some squirrels. I've heard that it comes at pretty good high success rates. This other one we have here is basically a bird trap. It's an Ojibwa bird trap, and we see there's a small piece of wood connected to a larger post through a very small hole. We have a piece of string attached to a rock feeding through that hole. and basically a little noose here that's going to grab the feet of the bird. When the bird lands, breaks the pole, noose grabs along their feet, the weight is able to drop down, and they'll be attached to that pole, hopefully waiting for you in the case of survival trapping. I definitely recommend you look up these techniques further. We don't have quite the time to explain them in this course in any more detail, but good techniques to know for these survival type situations. So finally, let's just kind of touch on a summary of what we learned today. We learned that hypothermia can kill you in a matter of 3 hours. That's not something that we want to play with, so one of our first priorities is going to be acquiring those things that keep us warm. That includes, before we go out, it includes great gear, great clothing, and understanding of layering and weather protection. We want to ensure we have the ability to make a shelter, whether or not it's an improvised shelter or something that we carry with us that we can easily use. We also want a couple of different mechanisms to make fire. We want to have great tinder, something that lights easily. Vaseline and cotton balls was our example. We want to have a nice amount of kindling, which is those smaller size twigs that we're going to use to light on fire aggressively, and we also want some larger pieces of fuel to keep our fire going. Later on, we want to understand our gear and how we like to use it. So basically, understand what you have access to, and how you plan on utilizing it. So it's not a surprise. It's not all based on improvisation. Depending on what environment you're going into and what your levels of risk assessment are, carefully think about how you might change what you bring with you. Maybe it's not the same kit every single time you go into the backcountry, but hopefully you have some variations on that basic kit. Finally, practice, suffer, and practice. So learn what it is to suffer, put yourself through some challenging times in the wilderness in a controlled environment so that when things go bad, you know what your stress reactions are, you have some skills built up, and you have the ability to survive. So I hope that this lecture clues you in on some topics of clothing, how clothing can really be used as a risk mitigation tool, and in the event of survival when we're lost, hurt, or otherwise misplaced in the wilderness, we have a few techniques to get us by until we're found and back at home. Thank you. Please refer to your online page for further instructions regarding the discussions that are attached to this lecture, as well as the quizzes that may follow. Thanks, guys.